Today I have 3 stories, 3 proverbs, and 3 practices that all honorable leaders practice. First story, 2 weeks ago, I was leaving my house on a Saturday morning to play pickleball with my sons and some of their friends. And so we're talking about people in their 30s and 20s. And as I'm walking out of the door, my wife looks at me and says, "Remember, you're 64, you're not 34. I kind of rolled my eyes, got in the car, drove. We played one game. 15 minutes in, I'm laying on the ground. I heard this pop, and I'm on my way to the emergency room, calling my wife and telling her that I forgot. I didn't remember. Key lesson there, if you're going to play pickleball, play with people your own age. And listen to your wife, especially the older you get. The second couple of stories are a little more serious. One of them had to do with when I was pastoring a local church, I was doing marriage counseling with a couple, and every time the man was confronted with a sin, a violation, something they needed to change, his response was always the same. I don't understand. And we would re-explain why his action, his attitude, his words were offensive, and he would always respond with, "I don't understand." And after multiple times with this man, I looked at him and I said, "I don't think it's that you don't understand. You're just not willing to change." He kept saying he didn't understand. Third story, I was debating a colleague, and actually many times this has happened, debating a colleague over a theological and missiological issue. And we were not on the same page. And we were going back and forth over this issue, and others that were involved around this kind of round table of leaders. Everyone was on the same page except this one colleague. And this man was stuck. Very godly, very great leader, but he was stuck theologically, philosophically, missiologically on this one place and could not go forward. His mind was stuck. His brain was stuck. And he could not leave that conversation, even though no one was in that place. Everyone else was sort of on the other side of the issue. It's not that the people took sides, but on the other side of that theological, missiological, theological issue, philosophical issue. And he was stuck. And so 3 stories that go into the Proverbs I want to read. One, I didn't listen to my wife and I paid the price, still paying the price. Another man who didn't really have any will to change, pushed it off as I don't really understand. And another colleague who was stuck. And these 3 Proverbs will give you the key to understand. They'll give you the key to get unstuck. And we'll look at what this says. First, let's read it. Proverbs 15, verses 31, 32, and 33. And we're trying to learn how to think like a leader. And boy, this is a powerful lesson in thinking like a leader right here. The ear that hears the rebuke of life will abide among the wise. He who disdains instruction despises his own soul, but he who heeds rebuke gets understanding. The fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom, and before honor is humility. All right, I said there are 3 stories, but then 3 practices of leaders who are honorable. In this verse 33, it says, before honor is humility. And this whole little package of verses right here ends with the idea of honor. And so what we see here is in verse 31, we have someone who hears rebuke. That's the first practice, learning how to hear rebuke. I didn't even hear my wife's warning about acting my age instead of pretending I was younger, and I suffered for it. We need to learn as leaders to hear, and to hear things we don't want to hear things we don't agree with, to hear things that correct and reprove and even rebuke, which is a direct confrontation, not in harshness and not unkind, but truth spoken in love. And so the first one here is hears rebuke. Second practice, heeds rebuke. It's possible to hear rebuke and not do anything about it. Heed means we actually change our direction and change our behavior, and we don't do something we were going to do. We stop doing something we've been doing, or we do something that we never intended to do. That's heeding. It has to do with action. Hearing has to do with what's going on and mentally. Heeding has to do with following through. And then it says, before honor is humility, and humility is that third practice. And so as leaders, if we want honor, which is the end of this story, this end of this little set of Proverbs is honor. The one who is going to have honor is one who hears rebuke, heeds rebuke, and walks in humility. Hearing, heeding, and humbling self brings honor. Verse 31 tells us that when we hear rebuke, we end up with wisdom. Everybody wants wisdom. Verse 32 says that when we heed rebuke, we get understanding, and everybody wants understanding. And then 33 says that when we're humble, we get honor. You see, we all want wisdom and understanding and honor. But most of the time, even leaders, we don't want to hear rebuke. We don't want to heed rebuke, and we don't want to humble ourselves. But those are the practices. As leaders, hearing, heeding, and humbling, those are the practices. And when I say practices, it's something we practice. It's something that we do, and hopefully the more we do it, the more natural it becomes. When you practice something, whether it's an instrument or a sport or whatever it is you practice, it becomes natural, it becomes habitual, it becomes something that we do without much effort the more we practice. And so, hearing rebuke, with practice, we can learn to do that instead of react. Heeding rebuke, we can learn to not wait until things deteriorate and crash and burn. We can learn by practice to heed immediately and humbling ourselves. That can be our first response, not our last response after everything is really a mess and it's obvious that it is a humiliating situation. So I remember one conversation when we think about hearing and heeding, and sometimes the tendency not to, a conversation with another minister where we were in a debate and really not agreeing on much of anything. And I made a point, and then he stopped. And he went, that's a good point. And he pondered that. And my colleague doing that changed the whole conversation. It had been a pretty combative disagreement over some strategic things that we were trying to budget items and trying to make decisions over. And we were both entrenched, standing our ground on really a good project and something really good, but we disagreed on the strategic next steps and the budget implications. But when I made a point trying to convince him and he paused, and what I realized in that moment, he's actually listening to me. I'm not sure I'm listening to him. I think I'm just waiting for him to stop talking so I can give my next point. But when he responded to my point, one out of about 4 or 5, and goes, that's a good point, and really pondered it, it changed the whole conversation, and we actually came to a good place of agreement and compromise and some of the things that are necessary as leaders. And so it's so important that we listen and that people know we're listening, not just nodding and pretending to listen until we can get our chance to talk, but actually listening and responding properly. If we want to be what the end of this in Proverbs is, this honor thing, this it all leads to honor, the hearing and heeding and humbling. It reminds me the idea of heeding in John 7:17. Jesus said, if anyone is willing to do my will, he will know whether the teaching is basically of God or of man. And so he says, if you're willing, you'll know. But see, a lot of times we want to know, we want to understand, we want to have full agreement. And until we have full agreement and until we totally, absolutely, 100% know, we're stuck and we can't move on. But that's not how spiritual life works, and it's not how spiritual leadership works. John 7:17, if anyone is willing to do the will of the Father, then he'll know whether the teaching is right. Then he will know whether this is the right direction to go, this is the right move. You have to be willing, then you know as you go and as you act on that. So if you're stuck, it's probably not an information issue. It's probably a will issue. It's not an understanding issue, it's a will issue. We have to get our will in motion and submitted to God. We have to hear and heed and humble ourselves. All that has to do with the will. Then the understanding and wisdom and all the other things we want come once we get unstuck. If you want to think like a leader and act like a leader, then my encouragement is to take the advice of Proverbs 15:31 through 33 and hear the things that you don't want to hear, heed the rebuke that come from people who care about you, and humble yourselves. And the more we do that, the more we think and act like leaders. Today's episode of Think Like a Leader is sponsored by the Middle Tennessee Orthopedic Surgeon Association. We want to thank you for funding us.